Michael Sarrazin learned early how to disappear in plain sight. He was photographed constantly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Lean frame, distant eyes, a face directors trusted with intensity rather than charm. Studios presented him as thoughtful, serious, reliable. The kind of actor who didn't cause problems. What they didn't photograph were the pauses. The gaps between jobs. The quiet negotiations with his own body and mind. When people talk about Michael Sarrazin now, they tend to talk about timing. About how his rise coincided with a brief window in Hollywood when restraint looked modern and ambiguity sold tickets. He fit that moment perfectly. And then, almost without explanation, the moment moved on. Privately, Sarrazin's life followed a pattern that appears again and again in personal accounts and production correspondence. Long periods of intense work followed by withdrawal. He didn't spiral publicly. He didn't self-destruct in headlines. Instead, he stepped back, answered fewer calls, took roles that required less visibility, traveled without telling people exactly where he was going. Friends later described him as hard to reach, even when he was in the room. He kept his apartment sparse. No excess furniture. No decoration that suggested permanence. Scripts stacked neatly. Ashtrays cleaned obsessively. He slept irregular hours, often late into the morning, then worked through the night. Phone records show a habit of calling at times when he assumed no one would answer, leaving messages that were factual, controlled, almost clinical. "I'm fine. Just checking something." That phrase appears more than once in preserved answering machine transcripts. Health concerns surfaced quietly. Not dramatic illnesses but accumulative ones. Respiratory issues. Chronic fatigue. Recurring infections that lingered longer than expected. Nothing that required public explanation. Enough to interfere with endurance. Enough to make long shoots harder each year. On sets, Sarrazin was known for precision. He arrived prepared. Hit his marks. Didn't complain. What producers noticed later, often too late, was how quickly he would leave once his scenes were done. No networking. No dinners. No cultivation of relationships that might lead to future roles. In Hollywood, absence is noticed faster than silence. Jane Fonda's career, by contrast, moved in the opposite direction toward visibility, control, and expansion. She learned to shape her narrative publicly, to manage exposure. Sarrazin never did. He allowed others to define the arc around him by default. By the mid-1970s, his roles grew smaller. Television replaced film. Guest appearances replaced leads. This wasn't framed as failure. It was explained as choice. He didn't correct that assumption. What emerges from correspondence during this period is a man negotiating limits, physical, psychological, and professional, without language for any of them. He declined projects quietly. Asked detailed questions about shooting conditions. About air quality. About night schedules. About how long scenes would require him to remain in confined spaces. These were not demands. They were precautions. There were also relationships that never fully stabilized. Sarrazin kept emotional distance even from people he trusted. Partners described him as kind but unreachable, affectionate but compartmentalized. He avoided shared routines. Avoided future planning. Lived as if everything were temporary, including success. When asked in interviews about ambition, he deflected. When asked about fame, he minimized it. When asked about personal life, he redirected entirely. That refusal to narrate himself became a liability. By the time audiences noticed he was gone, he had already adjusted to life without them. Smaller homes. Smaller crews. Smaller expectations. He worked just enough to remain solvent, not enough to be visible. He never wrote a memoir. Never attempted a comeback story. In later years, illness returned more forcefully. Cancer entered the picture quietly, without public campaigns or statements. Treatment schedules were private. Visitors were limited. Even then, he avoided drama. Doctors noted compliance. Friends noted withdrawal. The pattern held until the end. Michael Sarrazin didn't vanish suddenly. He receded. Layer by layer. Choice by choice. Decision by decision. And because there was no scandal, no collapse, no explanation demanded, the disappearance went largely unexamined. Which raises the question this story keeps circling back to. What happens to people who endure without visibility? Who absorb pressure quietly? Who survive environments that reward silence? And then are forgotten precisely because they never made noise? Because when fame moves on, it doesn't look back. And some lives, carefully controlled, quietly diminished, remain unfinished stories, not because they lacked meaning, but because no one ever stopped to listen long enough to hear what was being lost. By the early 1980s, Michael Sarrazin's name still appeared in casting lists, but it no longer carried urgency. It was there the way an old street name remains on a map after the neighborhood has changed, technically accurate, emotionally distant. Studios remembered him as reliable, serious, undemanding. None of those qualities generated momentum anymore. What did persist were the habits. He continued to live at the edges of schedules. Call times negotiated quietly. Contracts reviewed not for money but for conditions. Length of shoot days. Night work. Ventilation. Whether scenes required long stretches indoors. These questions rarely reached producers directly. They were filtered through agents, softened into neutral language. Health considerations. Personal preferences. No one pressed him on it. In private correspondence, Sarrazin wrote sparingly, but with precision. He tracked dates, symptoms, locations. A cough that returned after a specific shoot. Fatigue that worsened in enclosed sets. He didn't draw conclusions. He didn't accuse. He documented. As if the act of recording might one day make sense of what his body was refusing to articulate aloud. Friends noticed he carried tissues constantly, even when he wasn't sick. Not as a nervous tic but as preparation. He washed his hands obsessively. Avoided crowded rooms. Preferred open windows even in winter. If a conversation moved toward nostalgia films, premieres, fame, he redirected it toward logistics. Where someone was staying. How long they'd be in town. When they were leaving. Time, for him, was always something to manage. The public never saw this version. What they saw, when they saw him at all, was a thinner man with the same controlled demeanor. Interviews grew rare. When they happened, his answers were brief, polite, carefully emptied of anything that might invite follow-up. He praised collaborators. Deflected personal questions. Never spoke about regret. But silence carries weight when it accumulates. By the 1990s, Sarrazin's life had narrowed further. Smaller residences. Fewer possessions. He avoided keeping anything he couldn't move easily. Medical appointments appeared on calendars more frequently than auditions. Tests. Follow-ups. Waiting rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old magazines. Cancer entered his life without drama. No announcement. No statement. Just a diagnosis passed quietly between professionals and a man who had spent decades learning how to endure without witnesses. Treatment schedules became another routine. He complied. Asked questions. Took notes. Visitors were limited. Conversations shorter. Those who did see him during this time remarked on his calm. Not denial. Not optimism. Something closer to acceptance but not the poetic kind. A practical acceptance. This is happening. This is the schedule. This is how we proceed. Even then he avoided framing himself as a victim. When someone suggested writing his story he declined. There's nothing unusual there, he said once according to a friend. It just didn't last. What's striking, listening back to tapes and reading transcripts, is how often he returned to the idea of endurance rather than achievement. He spoke about working conditions more than performances. About how long people could reasonably be expected to push themselves before something permanent changed. He never named that change. In the final years his world grew quieter still. Fewer calls returned. Messages left unanswered not out of neglect, but energy conservation. He chose carefully when to speak, when to rest, when to remain unreachable. Fame by then was a distant echo. The industry had moved on completely. And yet, traces remained. A folder labeled simply Notes. A series of dates with no explanation. A list of places, studios, sets, hospitals. And one repeated phrase, written in different years, different handwriting pressure, same words. Something stayed with me. No elaboration followed. The closer I look, the clearer it becomes that Michael Sarrazin didn't disappear because he failed, or because the industry rejected him. He disappeared because retreat was the only way he knew to maintain control over his body, his time, his narrative. In a system that rewards exposure, he chose containment. But containment has its cost. Because when someone steps back quietly without scandal or spectacle, the record grows thin. Details blur. Motives are assumed rather than understood. And the spaces where answers should be remain unlit. Which leaves us here listening for what wasn't said. Looking at what was carefully removed from view. And trying to understand how a life shaped by discipline, silence, and endurance slowly narrowed into absence. Without ever announcing that it was leaving at all. There is a moment in every long investigation when the material stops behaving like history and starts behaving like a presence. It happens quietly. You notice it when you replay the same tape again, not because you miss something but because it feels incomplete without repetition. That's where Michael Sarrazin's story settled for me. In the late 1990s he lived mostly indoors. Not shut in, not hidden, just contained. Windows cracked open regardless of season. Furniture positioned away from walls as if airflow mattered more than comfort. Visitors remember the smell first, clean but overly so. Disinfectant layered over something metallic. Medication bottles arranged neatly, labels facing outward, dates marked with a pen. Control expressed through order. He rarely spoke about acting anymore. When he did, it wasn't about performances or recognition. It was about duration. How long a scene takes to film. How long bodies are expected to hold tension. How many hours a person can stay under artificial light before something subtle begins to shift. He asked these questions as if they applied universally, not just to him. People assumed illness explained everything. It doesn't. Illness accounts for weakness, for absence, for fatigue. It doesn't explain the caution that predated diagnosis by decades. The careful distancing. The way he always seemed to be preparing for an exit long before one was necessary. There are medical notes that mention compliance without complaint. Patient asks detailed questions. Patient shows awareness of environmental factors. Patient avoids extended stays. Even then he framed discomfort as logistics, not fear. He wanted to know what could be adjusted, not what it meant. At some point, correspondence from studios stopped entirely. No rejection letters. No formal endings. Just silence, reciprocal and complete. He no longer existed as a professional concern. Only as a name remembered by people who had once worked beside him and later wondered, briefly, what had happened. One former crew member told me years later that Sarrazin used to linger after rap even when he was exhausted. Not to socialize. To listen. To the building settling. To ventilation systems shutting down. To the absence of movement. Like he was checking whether the room was safe again, the man said, then paused, unsure if that made sense. It does. Because safety for Sarrazin was never abstract. It was physical. Immediate. Negotiated minute by minute. And when that negotiation failed, he withdrew rather than protest. Silence instead of resistance. Distance instead of confrontation. Toward the end he stopped correcting people who misremembered him. When someone said he'd retired early by choice, he let it stand. When someone said he'd been unlucky, he didn't disagree. The truth required too much explanation. An explanation for him had always been a kind of exposure. After his death, there was no public reckoning. No revisiting of conditions. No reconsideration of the environments that shaped a generation of performers who were praised for endurance rather than protected for sustainability. Obituaries were brief. Respectful. Clean. But files don't lie. Dates line up. Symptoms repeat. Patterns emerge when you stop looking for scandal and start looking for accumulation. Small compromises made daily. Air breathed without question. Expectations accepted because everyone accepted them. Michael Sarrazin didn't leave behind accusations. He left behind documentation. And documentation is quieter, harder to argue with, easier to ignore. What remains unresolved isn't whether something happened to him. Something clearly did. What remains unresolved is how many others experienced the same slow erosion and never had the language or the distance to notice it while it was happening. Because disappearance doesn't always arrive as an event. Sometimes it unfolds as a series of reasonable decisions. Fewer roles. Shorter days. Closed doors. And a life that contracts carefully, politely, until it exists almost entirely out of frame. And the question that lingers now isn't where Michael Sarrazin went. It's how many stories like his are still buried under applause, waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear what was always in the air. At the end, there was no dramatic turning point. No confession. No revelation that suddenly explained everything retroactively. Michael Sarrazin's life did not resolve itself into a neat final act. It slowed. It thinned out. It became quieter in a way that felt intentional, as if noise itself had become something to avoid. In the final months he kept the television off. Friends noticed that when they visited, the apartment seemed suspended in a kind of permanent late afternoon. Curtains half drawn. Light filtered rather than direct. He preferred sitting where he could see the window but not be seen from outside. Even then he spoke calmly. Asked about other people's lives. Remembered details most had forgotten he ever knew. He did not revisit the past unless prompted, and when prompted, he never lingered. Films were mentioned as work, not milestones. Fame as circumstance, not identity. When someone brought up they shoot horses, don't they? He nodded once, politely, as if acknowledging a shared reference point rather than a defining chapter. No bitterness. No pride. Just distance. Medical care became routine. Appointments blended together. Names of drugs changed. The questions he asked remained the same. How long? How enclosed? How much exposure? Doctors interpreted this as anxiety. It wasn't. It was consistency. A way of relating to the world that had been shaped long before illness gave it an official explanation. What stands out, reviewing the final notes, is how little he asked for help. Assistance was accepted but never requested. He organized his own papers, marked dates himself, ensured that nothing was left ambiguous. When arrangements were discussed, he listened carefully, corrected details quietly, and moved on. He behaved the way someone does when they've learned, over time, that clarity is a form of mercy. After his death, there were a few phone calls between people who hadn't spoken in years. A few conversations that ended with the same sentence. I always wondered what happened to him. The question lingered, unanswered, because there was no single event to point to. No collapse. No scandal. No headline that forced recognition. What happened to Michael Sarrazin was gradual and ordinary and therefore easy to overlook. He lived in an industry that celebrated endurance but rarely protected it. Where controlled suffering was reframed as commitment. Where environments were optimized for output, not longevity. He adapted by withdrawing just enough to survive, and in doing so he slowly stepped out of the frame entirely. In the end, his disappearance wasn't a failure of talent or relevance. It was the result of a lifetime of small, rational decisions made in response to conditions that were never designed to be questioned. Decisions to leave early. To say less. To keep distance. To breathe carefully. Listening back now, through the recordings, the notes, the silences between statements, what emerges isn't a mystery so much as a warning, quiet, understated, easy to ignore if you're not paying attention. Fame tells us who matters while they are visible. It rarely tells us what visibility costs, or who absorbs that cost without complaint. Michael Sarrazin absorbed it quietly. Completely. And when there was nothing left to absorb, he left behind not a scandal, but a record fragmented, restrained, human that asks us to reconsider how many lives are shaped, diminished, and eventually erased not by failure but by endurance itself. And once you hear that story clearly, it becomes difficult not to listen for others like it's still unfolding, still unnoticed, still breathing carefully in rooms the world insists are safe.